7,000 corpses in 4 hours. That is not metaphor. That is not chronicle exaggeration. That is the documented body count from August 12th, 1099, when 1,200 exhausted crusaders marched out of Jerusalem in absolute darkness and attacked 20,000 Egyptian warriors who outnumbered them 17-1. By the time the sun reached its peak overhead, the coastal plain near Ascalon would be carpeted with the dead in formations that told the story of systematic slaughter. Mamluk cavalry who had never known defeat lying twisted among their horses. Sudanese infantry sprawled in windows where Norman lances carved bloody furrows through. Packed ranks, the finest professional army in Islam, reduced to scattered survivors fleeing towards city. Walls. This is the story of how mathematical impossibility became documented military history. How a dawn attack that defied every tactical principle rewrote the rules of medieval warfare, and how Duke Godfrey of Bouillon proved that desperation refined into perfect execution can overcome any numerical disadvantage. But before we talk about the 4 hours that changed the strategic balance of the entire Mediterranean world, you need to understand the nightmare scenario that made this suicidal attack seem like the only rational choice available. July 15th, 1099, just 2 weeks before the battle that would define the First Crusade's legacy. The morning sun blazed mercilessly over Jerusalem's blood-stained walls as Duke Godfrey of Bouillon received news that should have meant the absolute end of everything. The Crusaders had fought for. 3 dust-covered scouts stumbled into his command tent, their horses lathered with foam from being ridden nearly to death, bearing reports of an Egyptian army so vast it seemed to darken the southern horizon. Al-Afdal ibn Badr al-Jamali, the most feared general in the entire Islamic world, was marching north with 20,000 fresh professional troops to reclaim the Holy, a city that Crusaders had captured just 14 days earlier after a siege that had consumed nearly everything, against this oceanic force approaching from Egypt. Godfrey could muster perhaps 1,200 effective fighting men, and that number included knights so wounded they could barely mount their horses, and infantry so sick with dysentery they could barely hold their weapons. The mathematics were absolutely terrifying in their simplicity. 17 Egyptian warriors for every single Crusader knight. Picture the nightmare that Godfrey faced in that sweltering command tent. Jerusalem had fallen just 2 weeks earlier after a siege that consumed everything the Crusader army possessed. The great expedition that had marched from Europe with 60,000 souls, pilgrims and warriors combined, now barely filled a village square. Disease had killed more Crusaders than Muslim swords ever did. Battle casualties had mounted throughout 4 years of continuous warfare, and the brutal Levantine heat that turned European armor into ovens had reduced the expedition to this pitiful remnant. Each surviving knight represented years of intensive training and equipment, worth a fortune equal to an entire manor back in Europe. But flesh and steel meant absolutely nothing against such overwhelming numerical odds. Godfrey himself bore the visible scars of Jerusalem's recent conquest all over his body. At 39 years old, the Duke of Lower Lorraine had proven himself the expedition's finest battlefield. Commander through campaigns from Nicaea to Antioch, but even his tactical genius proven in a dozen desperate battles, seemed completely inadequate against Al-Afdal's host approaching from the south. The Egyptian vizier commanded 5,000 Mamluk heavy cavalry, slave soldiers who had been purchased as children and trained from that age exclusively in mounted warfare until they became perfect killing machines. Behind them marched 15,000 infantry organized in precise formations, including Sudanese spearmen whose bronze-tipped weapons could punch through chainmail, like parchment and Nubian archers whose composite bows required 150 pounds of draw strength. The Egyptian baggage train supporting this massive force required 3,000 camels. Just to transport supplies, here is what the chronicles written by monks do not tell you about that sweltering morning in Godfrey's command tent. The choice he faced was not simply between fighting and dying in some heroic last stand. Staying in Jerusalem to endure siege meant facing forces that had retaken this city from Seljuk Turks just 1 year earlier using proven methods. Al-Afdal knew every weakness in the ancient walls from that campaign. Egyptian siege engineers who had reduced fortresses throughout North Africa could starve out the defenders within weeks, turning the Crusaders' triumph into history's cruelest irony. But marching out to meet the enemy meant certain annihilation in open battle against a professional army. Traditional Crusader tactics relied on heavy cavalry charges that shattered enemy formations through sheer momentum and weight. Against Al-Afdal's disciplined ranks that had broken larger armies using proven doctrine, such attacks would accomplish nothing except a spectacular suicide. That would be remembered as a footnote. The Egyptian commander had perfected methods that made European knights irrelevant. Mamluk archers would shower approaching cavalry with arrows that found gaps in armor. Then heavy lancers would finish the survivors in close combat. Simple tactics, devastatingly effective. Absolutely inevitable given the numbers involved. Raymond of Toulouse, the expedition's eldest commander, at 59 years old, with decades of campaign experience, counseled desperate defense with the voice of hard-won wisdom. Strip Jerusalem's recently conquered population for supplies, concentrate every man who could hold a weapon behind the strongest sections of wall, pray for relief forces from Antioch that might arrive in weeks. Tancred of Antioch, barely 25 but already legendary throughout the Crusader states for battlefield audacity that bordered on insanity, argued passionately for immediate attack before Egyptian preparations could be completed. Strike now while they are still organizing. He insisted, before they establish siege lines that would make escape impossible. Both solutions led inevitably to destruction, just by different timelines and methods. The scouts' reports painted Al-Afdal's position with precision that chilled veteran hearts who had survived 4 years of continuous warfare. The Egyptian army had established camp near Ascalon, 12 miles southwest of Jerusalem along the coast, controlling the road that connected Egypt to Syria. From that position, they could either besiege the holy city at their leisure, or intercept any Crusader attempt to retreat toward Antioch, where reinforcements might be gathered. The trap was absolutely perfect from a strategic perspective. As afternoon shadows lengthened across Jerusalem's newly conquered towers, Godfrey made his calculations with the cold logic that had kept him alive through a dozen impossible situations. 1,200 men against 20,000 professional warriors. Exhausted knights who could barely stay in their saddles, against fresh troops who had marched from Egypt. Desperate Christians fighting for survival against confident Muslims who had never lost. Major engagement. Every military manual ever written in any language declared the outcome mathematically. Inévitable. But here is what the chronicles do not tell you about Godfrey's decision in that moment. The choice was not really between victory and defeat in any conventional sense. It was between two different kinds of destruction. Two different ways for Christianity's presence in the Holy Land to end. And in that impossible moment of clarity, a revolutionary tactic was born that would rewrite the fundamental rules of medieval warfare forever. Al-Afdal's war machine that emerged from the Egyptian delta represented the absolute pinnacle of medieval Islamic military organization, perfected over centuries. Picture the terrifying spectacle approaching Ascalon's walls that Crusader scouts reported with voices that trembled. The vizier's 20,000 warriors marched in perfect columns that stretched 8 miles across the coastal plain. Their daily consumption of grain and dates and water equaling the needs of a city of 50,000 civilians. The dust cloud from their advance could be seen from Jerusalem's towers 30 miles away, a brown smudge against the azure Mediterranean sky that grew larger and more threatening. With each passing hour, at the army's core rode 5,000 Mamluks, the slave soldiers who represented Islam's answer to European heavy cavalry. Each warrior carried a composite bow capable of piercing mail at 200 yards, plus lance and sword and mace for close combat. Their horses, bred from Arabian and Berber stock, could sustain galloping speeds for miles that European destriers, bred for shock charges, could only manage in short, devastating bursts. These were not conscripted peasants dragged from farms or feudal levies serving minimum terms. These were professional killers who had crushed Fatimid enemies from Sudan to Syria. Warriors whose entire existence centered on warfare. Behind the cavalry came 15,000 infantry organized in precise formations that had conquered half of North Africa through discipline. Sudanese spearmen, their bronze points gleaming like stars under the desert sun. Nubian archers whose bows could punch through shields and armor. Syrian engineers hauling siege equipment that could reduce Jerusalem's walls to rubble. Within weeks, once properly deployed, the logistics alone demonstrated Islamic military superiority that Crusaders could not match. Where Crusader armies barely managed basic supply lines and often starved between cities, Al-Afdal's quartermasters coordinated provisions for forces larger than most European cities with mathematical precision. But here is what chroniclers barely mention about those crucial days in mid-July while the Egyptian army approached. While Al-Afdal prepared methodically for siege operations, the Crusader leadership structure was actively disintegrating from within. Raymond of Toulouse, the expedition's nominal supreme commander, had fallen gravely ill from infected wounds received during Jerusalem's bloody assault. 2 weeks earlier, fever ravaged his body as he lay semi-conscious in a requisitioned palace, unable to provide strategic direction when it was most desperately needed by forces facing annihilation. Without his unifying authority that had held fractious nobles together for 4 years, the remaining commanders fell into familiar destructive patterns of mistrust and competition for glory. Tancred of Antioch controlled perhaps 400 men, but his forces were scattered across newly conquered territories hundreds of miles apart, establishing garrison control over a hostile population that outnumbered them 50 to Robert of Normandy commanded another 300 knights, yet spent more time arguing bitterly over division of Jerusalem's spoils than preparing defenses against the approaching doom. The great Crusader army that had terrified Islam from Nicaea to Antioch no longer existed as a cohesive fighting force. Intelligence reports trickling into Godfrey's headquarters painted an increasingly desperate picture with each passing day. Egyptian scouts probed Jerusalem's perimeter daily, systematically mapping defensive positions, counting defenders on the walls, identifying weak points in fortifications hastily repaired after the recent siege. Al-Afdal was not rushing towards some hasty assault that might give crusaders opportunities. He was conducting methodical preparation for total victory that would crush Christian presence in the region. The numbers grew worse with each passing hour that scouts reported. Dysentery struck the Crusader camp in waves, reducing effective fighters by dozens daily as men could not keep down food or water. Summer heat in the Judean hills reached temperatures that left European knights prostrate by midday, their mail armor becoming literal furnaces that cooked flesh beneath steel. Water sources outside Jerusalem's walls required dangerous foraging expeditions as Egyptian cavalry patrols systematically tightened their noose around the holy city. Then everything changed on the evening of August 11th when Godfrey called a final council of war. The assembled commanders gathered in the captured dome of the rock, hastily converted into a Christian chapel, meeting in a space still stained with Muslim blood from the conquest. Godfrey spread maps across tables, studying routes and calculating distances and weighing impossible options with the focus of a merchant examining account books. The assembled commanders represented Christianity's last hope in the East, yet their combined forces barely matched a single division of Al-Afdal's army. What happened next in that council chamber defied every principle of medieval strategy, developed over centuries of warfare. Instead of preparing for siege defense that might last weeks, or negotiating terms of honorable surrender that would preserve some lives, Godfrey announced the most audacious military decision since Hannibal crossed the Alps. With elephants, they would march out at dawn in complete darkness and attack Al-Afdal's overwhelming host in open battle, where numerical superiority mattered most. The assembled knights stared in stunned silence at their commander. Military suicide had never been announced so calmly or reasoned so logically. But Godfrey had identified something in the situation that others missed. Surprise was the only weapon that could multiply their force beyond mathematics. Al-Afdal expected siege or desperate defense, not aggression from forces. He outnumbered 17 to 1. If Crusaders could strike the Egyptian camp before it organized for battle, if they could create chaos that prevented coordinated response, if they could kill enough enemies fast enough, mathematical certainty might waver just long enough for courage to matter. It was insane. It was impossible. It was the only chance they had. August the 12th, 4:17 in the morning, according to chronicles that recorded the time with precision, absolute darkness shrouded the Judean hills as 1,200 crusaders began their final march toward what every rational calculation said would be their graves. No trumpets announced their departure from Jerusalem's gates. No banners flew in the pre-dawn stillness that was broken only by the sound of boots on stone. Godfrey of Bouillon had ordered complete silence under penalty of death as his tiny army crept through the city like ghosts seeking their own deaths. Each footstep on the ancient stones echoed with finality that men could feel in their bonus. The formation that emerged from Jerusalem's gates defied every convention of crusader. Warfare developed over 4 years of hard campaigning. Instead of the traditional heavy cavalry vanguard followed by struggling infantry that marched separately, Godfrey had created something revolutionary, born from desperation. 3 coordinated divisions moved in perfect synchronization across the rocky terrain, like parts of a single organism. He personally commanded the center with 400 knights and men-at-arms. Raymond of Toulouse, despite fever that should have left him bedridden, insisted on leading the left wing with 350 infantry. Tancred of Antioch controlled the right with 450 mixed cavalry and foot soldiers who moved as one unit. Here is where legend meets tactical reality in ways that separate genius from competence. Medieval armies typically marched in loose columns that required hours to form proper battle lines once contact with the enemy occurred. Godfrey's force advanced, already organized for immediate combat deployment, each division maintaining precise intervals that allowed instant conversion to fighting. Formation. The innovation represented years of hard-won experience compressed into desperate necessity. These were not the enthusiastic pilgrims who had departed Europe 4 years earlier, singing hymns. These were veterans who understood that survival meant adapting tactics or dying, and they had learned adaptation through blood. The 12-mile approach, march through darkness, tested human endurance beyond normal. Limits that training prepared men for knights in 80 pounds of mail hauled themselves across broken ground while maintaining absolute silence that meant death if broken. Infantry carried 14-foot spears that caught on rocks and scrub brush with every step, requiring constant attention to prevent noise, the August heat, even at night. Left men gasping for water they could not spare to drink because canteens needed to last. Through battle, yet discipline held with iron determination, born of knowing that a single noise, one stumbling horse, one piece of equipment clanking against armor, could alert Egyptian sentries and doom them all to massacre. By 5:30 in the morning, the eastern horizon began glowing pale gold as dawn approached, and Godfrey's scouts reported Egyptian positions visible ahead. Al-Afdal's massive camp sprawled across the coastal plain like a temporary city of 20,000 inhabitants. Cooking fires dotted the landscape where warriors prepared morning meals in comfortable confidence that no enemy would dare attack such overwhelming force. The Egyptian commander had positioned his forces with the mathematical precision of an engineer. Heavy cavalry picketed near the sea to prevent any escape by water. Infantry camps blocked inland routes toward Antioch. Command tents occupied the center, protected by concentric rings of Mamluk guards who were the finest soldiers in Islam. But Al-Afdal had made one critical miscalculation that would cost him everything. His overwhelming numerical superiority had bred complacency that comes from never facing desperate enemies. Egyptian sentries watched for messengers and supply convoys approaching from expected directions, not suicide attacks by forces. They outnumbered 17 to 1. The great general's tactical doctrine, proven in dozens of successful campaigns, assumed rational enemies who understood mathematical impossibility and acted accordingly. He had never faced desperate Christians who believed that God demanded miracles and that death in battle guaranteed paradise. Dawn broke with shocking suddenness across the Mediterranean sky, revealing the Crusader divisions positioned just 400 yards from the sleeping Egyptian camp. Godfrey raised his sword high. Morning light catching the steel like divine fire that seemed to burn. The signal passed instantly through prearranged hand gestures that required no sound. No horns blowing charges, no battle cries announcing attack. Just sudden, coordinated violence erupting from nowhere like lightning from clear sky. The outer Egyptian pickets died before they could even scream warnings to wake their comrades. Tancred's cavalry struck like the wrath of God. Lances spearing sentries who were still rubbing sleep from their eyes and trying to understand what was happening. Raymond's infantry stormed through gaps in the camp perimeter, cutting down confused guards who could not comprehend how Christians had materialized. From empty air, Godfrey's center division punched straight toward Al-Afdal's command position, carving through tents where Egyptian officers struggled into armor while still half asleep and disoriented. What happened in those first 20 minutes defied every military manual ever written in any language. Surprise attacks succeeded through careful planning and superior intelligence about enemy positions. The Crusaders possessed neither advantage except desperation refined into perfect tactical execution through ruthless discipline. They had achieved what should have been impossible: complete strategic surprise against a professional force that should have detected them miles away through standard security procedures. Crusader steel cut through canvas tent walls, the fabric offering no resistance as knights pushed through. Screams in Arabic echoed across endless rows of tents as men died in their sleep or scrambling for weapons. The crash of collapsing pavilions as panicked horses trampled guy ropes filled the air. Al-Afdal's perfectly organized military city transformed into a slaughter pen in 17 minutes of coordinated violence that military science said could never happen against professional armies. Tancred's 450 cavalry carved through the Egyptian horse lines like scythes through wheat, the agricultural metaphor horribly appropriate. Mamluk warriors, the absolute finest heavy cavalry in all of Islam, died struggling desperately into saddles, while Christian lances found the gaps between mail rings with practiced precision. The mathematics were brutal in their simplicity. Each mounted crusader potentially faced combat with 40 enemies based on raw numbers, but surprise compressed those overwhelming odds into hundreds of individual encounters where superior European armor and desperate fury overcame numerical disadvantage. Completely, Crusader knights in full mail could absorb blows that would kill lighter armored Mamluks. European swords, designed for crushing through defenses carved through Egyptian equipment, and men fighting for survival with absolute commitment simply killed faster than men, fighting from comfortable confidence. But then Al-Afdal's tactical genius emerged from the chaos like order from entropy. The Egyptian vizier had not conquered half of North Africa through panic or incompetence when facing setbacks. From his command position near the Mediterranean, where he could see the entire developing disaster, he watched the slaughter unfold with calculating precision that separated great commanders from merely competent ones. His drum signals echoed across the camp, calling scattered units to predetermined rally points that had been established days. Earlier, within 30 minutes, that felt like hours. 5,000 Mamluk cavalry had withdrawn beyond Crusader reach, forming disciplined ranks on the coastal plain where open ground and numerical superiority could finally matter. The counterattack, when it came, struck like divine retribution from an angry god. Egyptian heavy cavalry thundered forward in waves that literally shook the earth beneath. Their hooves, with the weight of 5,000 horses moving as one. The sound defied any description that words could capture. 20,000 iron horseshoes hitting packed sand created percussive force that men felt in their bones before the sound reached their ears. Dust clouds rose 100 feet into the air, turning morning sunlight into apocalyptic twilight that seemed like the end of the world. Godfrey's center division, caught scattered through the Egyptian camp, pursuing fleeing enemies, faced immediate annihilation that seemed inevitable. His 400 knights had spread too thin in the intoxication of impossible initial success. Their formation dissolved in the excitement of killing enemies who could not fight back effectively. Now, Mamluk lancers bore down on isolated groups of Christians who could not possibly retreat fast enough to reach defensive positions before being overtaken and slaughtered. Here is where desperation met tactical brilliance in ways that would be studied for centuries. Instead of ordering retreat that would inevitably become massacre as men fled in panic, Godfrey commanded the opposite: advance toward the enemy. The remaining Crusader divisions abandoned profitable camp looting to form defensive squares that bristled with 14-foot spears like metal hedgehogs. Infantry locked shields in overlapping walls, while knights dismounted to fight on foot, their heavy armor providing protection that mobility could not match against such overwhelming numbers. The collision, when it came, redefined violence in ways that witnesses struggled to describe afterward. Mamluk cavalry struck Crusader formations at full gallop. The impact, like hammers hitting anvils, lances shattered against interlocked shields. Horses screamed as they impaled themselves on Christian spears held firm by men who knew retreat meant death. The front ranks of both armies simply disappeared in mutual destruction. Egyptian riders died pressed against Frankish steel they could not penetrate. Crusader infantry collapsed under the weight of fallen horses and men that crushed them. Casualties mounted with mathematical precision that accountants could later calculate. In 27 minutes of sustained close combat, 800 Egyptian cavalry lay dead or dying on sand turning red. The Crusaders had lost 150 men. Grievous losses for their tiny force that could not afford such casualties. Yet the exchange rate remained catastrophically in their favor rather than the Egyptians. Al-Afdal's overwhelming numbers were bleeding away against Christian discipline and superior defensive tactics that turned numerical advantage into liability. But the Egyptian commander was not retreating or admitting defeat. He was learning from each failed assault. The next wave combined mounted archery with infantry support, forcing Crusader squares to contract while arrows fell like steel rain from composite. Mamluk bows capable of piercing mail at 200 yards found gaps in formations. Stressed beyond their breaking points by continuous assault, young knights collapsed with Turkish arrow shafts protruding from shoulders and thighs. The wounds not immediately fatal, but incapacitating. The crisis that threatened to break Crusader resistance came when Raymond of Toulouse, leading from the very front despite his fever, took an arrow through the throat that should have killed him instantly. The old count staggered, but somehow remained upright, blood streaming down his surcoat as he continued shouting orders through vocal cords that barely functioned. His men, seeing their commander literally dying on his feet but refusing to fall, fought with fury that transcended normal human limitations driven by loyalty. Tancred seized this moment with the instinct of a predator. His cavalry reformed after their initial rampage through the camp, struck Al-Afdal's exposed flank at precisely the instant when Egyptian attention focused entirely on Raymond's wavering division. The young Norman prince led from the very front, his lance taking an Egyptian emir through the chest at full gallop, the impact nearly unhorsing Tancred. Behind him, 200 mounted knights carved through packed infantry who could not form defensive ranks quickly enough to resist the charge. The mathematics of the battle had shifted in ways no one could have predicted at dawn. By 8:30 in the morning, Al-Afdal faced a tactical impossibility that his experience could not explain. His army had lost 2,000 dead against 400 Crusader casualties. A 4-to-1 exchange rate that should not exist when attacking outnumbered defenders. More critically for the battle's outcome, Egyptian morale was visibly cracking as warriors who had conquered from Cairo to Damascus found themselves systematically destroyed by forces they still outnumbered 10-1. Then Godfrey made a decision that defied every rule of medieval warfare developed over centuries. Instead of consolidating their defensive success and perhaps withdrawing to Jerusalem to celebrate survival, he ordered general advance against Al-Afdal's remaining 18,000 troops in open battle. The entire Crusader army, all who could still fight, would attack in coordinated assault. The silence that descended after Godfrey's impossible final charge carried weight beyond any human comprehension of battlefield victory. By 9:15 in the morning, less than 4 hours after dawn, the coastal plain near Ascalon resembled hell's own marketplace, as described in fevered sermons. 7,000 Egyptian dead carpeted the battlefield in formations that told the clear story of systematic destruction by inferior numbers. Mamluk cavalry, Islam's finest horsemen who had never known defeat, lay twisted among their mounts in geometric patterns where Crusader squares had held, firm against impossible odds. Sudanese infantry sprawled in windrows where Norman lances had carved bloody furrows. Through packed ranks like ploughs through earth, Al-Afdal's mighty host that had numbered 20,000 professional warriors at dawn had simply disintegrated. The Egyptian vizier himself fled toward Ascalon's protective walls with perhaps 3,000 survivors from an army that had seemed invincible. Behind him lay not just military defeat, but the complete collapse of Fatimid power projection into the Levant that would last 4 decades. The mathematical impossibility that every calculation said could not happen had become documented reality, witnessed by chroniclers from both sides who could not deny what they. Godfrey dismounted among the carnage, his sword arm hanging useless from wounds that would never fully heal despite the best medical care available. The Duke of Lower Lorraine had personally killed 11 Egyptian warriors in close combat, including 2 Mamluk emirs whose richly decorated bodies lay within reach of his banner. Yet victory's cost showed in every line of his battle-scarred face that had aged years. In hours, the Crusader army that had achieved the impossible numbered barely 800. effective fighters from the 1200 who had marched out at dawn in darkness. The battlefield's spoils defied belief when quartermasters began cataloguing them. Al-Afdal's baggage train contained treasures accumulated through decades of Egyptian conquest across North Africa, gold dinars by the thousands that could ransom kingdoms, silk from Damascus worth a king's ransom by itself, spices from Indian Ocean trade routes more valuable than gold per pound, weapons and armor crafted in the finest workshops of Cairo that European smiths could not match. Individual Crusader knights found themselves suddenly wealthy beyond European noble standards, their participation in this impossible victory, earning material rewards that would transform their families' fortunes for generations to come. But here is what the chronicles barely mention about those crucial hours immediately. After victory, when the killing stopped, while common soldiers celebrated and counted plunder with the joy of men who expected to the surviving commanders grappled with strategic consequences that extended far beyond immediate triumph. Tancred of Antioch, bleeding from 3 separate wounds, but still mounted on his horse, advocated immediate pursuit of Al-Afdal's remnants fleeing toward Ascalon. Capture the city itself, he argued with the passion of youth. Complete the total destruction of Egyptian power in Palestine forever. Raymond of Toulouse, barely conscious from blood loss, yet still somehow commanding his division through sheer will, counseled caution with words that emerged as barely audible whispers through his ruined throat. The old count understood what younger knights blinded by victory could not grasp. They had achieved tactical miracle through desperation and perfect timing. But such circumstances could never be deliberately replicated. Better to consolidate gains than risk everything on continued aggression against an enemy who now knew what they faced. The human cost became brutally apparent as battlefield surgeons tallied casualties with precision. 300 Crusader dead lay scattered across the plain, including some of Christianity's finest knights, whose armor and weapons would never be replaced. Another 200 wounded so severely they would never fight again, crippled for life by wounds that medieval medicine could not properly treat. Raymond himself would die from his throat wound within 6 months. The greatest strategic mind of the First Crusade consumed by infection that no physician could cure. Yet the strategic transformation was absolutely complete in ways that would echo for decades. In 4 hours of impossible warfare, 1,200 exhausted Christians had eliminated the last serious military threat to their nascent kingdom. Al-Afdal's catastrophic defeat meant no Egyptian army would challenge Crusader control of Palestine for the next 20 years. The Fatimid Caliphate, after losing their finest troops in mathematical impossibility made real, would retreat to purely defensive positions around the Nile Delta and never again project power into the Levant. Individual acts of heroism emerged from survivor accounts that would echo through centuries of military history told in taverns and great halls. Brother William, a Hospitaller knight who held a breach in defensive formation alone for 7 minutes while reinforcements fought their way to his position, his mace rising and falling until his arm literally could not lift it anymore. Sergeant Hugh the Breton, whose crossbow killed 6 Mamluk officers with 6 shots before an Egyptian scimitar, found his unprotected neck and ended his war. Anonymous foot soldiers, whose names appear in no chronicle, but whose desperate courage made victory possible through actions witnessed by no one who survived to tell their stories. Picture the psychological impact on both armies that survived this impossible day. Egyptian survivors would return to Cairo bearing tales that defied all belief and military science. How could 1,200 Franks destroy forces that outnumbered them 17 to 1? Using conventional tactics, Islamic military doctrine based on mathematical calculation, and tactical superiority offered no rational explanation for such complete reversal of natural order. Some would claim sorcery, others divine punishment. But none could explain it through normal military analysis. The Crusaders themselves struggled to comprehend their own achievement even as they stood among the evidence. Many attributed victory to direct divine intervention, claiming they had witnessed angels fighting beside Christian ranks with flaming swords. Others recognized that tactical innovation combined with perfect timing had overcome impossible odds through purely human agency rather than supernatural intervention, though they kept such thoughts private. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the battlefield, still warm with recent death, Godfrey made the decision that would define his kingdom's future for generations. No pursuit of Al-Afdal's fleeing remnants back to Ascalon. No siege of a fortified city that would consume resources they lacked. Consolidation of gains rather than risky expansion that might squander everything won. The impossible victory had taught him that miracles could not be manufactured on demand, through willpower alone. And trying to repeat this achievement would likely end in the destruction they had narrowly avoided. The strategic earthquake that began at dawn near Ascalon's walls rippled across the medieval world for decades in ways that changed history. Within 18 months of their impossible victory, the Crusaders had transformed from desperate survivors hanging on by fingernails into the dominant military power in the entire Eastern Mediterranean. The tactical innovations born from mathematical desperation became standard doctrine for Christian armies from Antioch to Tripoli. Dawn attacks, coordinated division movements, infantry cavalry integration that had emerged from pure necessity now spread throughout. The Crusader states as proven methodology taught to every new knight arriving from Europe, but the deeper consequences extended far beyond tactical manuals studied in training. Al-Afdal's catastrophic defeat marked the permanent end of Fatimid military credibility throughout the Islamic world. The Egyptian Caliphate, which had ruled territories from Spain to Sudan for 2 centuries, never again fielded armies capable of challenging Crusader expansion northward. Their naval supremacy in the Eastern Mediterranean remained formidable, but without land forces to exploit it. Egyptian power withered into regional defensive posturing around the Nile Delta. Islamic military doctrine itself underwent fundamental revision because of lessons learned in blood at Ascalon. Muslim commanders who had relied confidently on numerical superiority and conventional tactics discovered that desperate enemies operating under impossible pressure could achieve results that defied mathematical calculation entirely. Future Islamic strategies emphasized avoiding pitched battles against consolidated Crusader forces, preferring siege warfare and attrition campaigns that negated Christian tactical advantages in open combat. The Crusader kingdom's survival depended entirely on the precedent established during those 4 hours of impossible combat in ways that shaped the next century. When Saladin finally emerged to challenge Christian dominance nearly a century later. He studied Ascalon's lessons with scholarly precision before every campaign. The great Kurdish commander understood that Frankish armies fighting for survival represented completely different opponents than Frankish armies fighting for conquest or glory. His brilliant strategy at Hattin in 1187 deliberately avoided giving Crusader forces the desperation that had made them invincible against Al-Afdal, instead trapping them in conditions where heat and thirst did the work before battle began. Individual military careers were transformed by participation in the mathematical miracle that survivors could barely believe. Tancred of Antioch leveraged his reputation from Ascalon to establish the most aggressive Crusader principality, expanding Christian control deep into northern Syria through campaigns that copied Godfrey's dawn attack methodology. His tactical manual, written in the months following victory, became required reading for every knight serving in the Latin East for generations. The psychological impact on Christian morale throughout Europe cannot be overstated. When news arrived, Ascalon's victory reached Western chronicles as definitive proof that divine favor supported the Crusader cause even against impossible odds. Recruitment for subsequent expeditions increased dramatically as nobles sought to participate in campaigns that had achieved documented miracles witnessed by hundreds. The impossible had become repeatable through proper preparation and absolute commitment. Or so the recruiters claimed. Yet the battle's most profound lesson involved limitation rather than capability, a lesson many ignored. Godfrey's wise decision to halt pursuit and consolidate gains demonstrated wisdom that many subsequent commanders ignored to their complete destruction. Military miracles, however spectacular, remained accidents of timing and circumstance that could not be manufactured through willpower alone. The mathematical impossibility that saved Jerusalem in 1099 represented unrepeatable convergence of factors that future battles would lack. Modern military academies study Ascalon primarily as the perfect example of combined arms coordination achieved through desperate innovation under pressure. The seamless integration of cavalry shock action with infantry defensive capability anticipated tactical developments that would not become standard military doctrine until centuries later. Staff colleges from Sandhurst to West Point analyzed the battle's lessons about force, multiplication through superior coordination and timing that overcomes numerical disadvantage. The 800 Crusader survivors who staggered back to Jerusalem that evening had fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the entire medieval world in ways they could barely comprehend. Their achievement echoed through 2 centuries of subsequent warfare, establishing tactical principles that defined Crusader military doctrine until the kingdom's final collapse in 1291. Every subsequent Christian victory in the East traced its genealogy back to those 4. Ours, when impossibility became reality through discipline and desperation, refined into perfect execution. If you want to understand how medieval warfare actually worked beyond Hollywood fantasies, subscribe now, because next week we are revealing the Crusader formation that could advance through arrow storms that would annihilate any other army. The testudo shield wall that Roman legions perfected and Crusaders adapted. The training methods that transformed ordinary men into the most feared infantry in the medieval world. And the one fatal weakness in Crusader tactics that Muslim commanders eventually learned to exploit systematically. bringing down the kingdom that Godfrey saved on that impossible morning. So smash that subscribe button, because understanding how these warriors actually fought changes everything you think you know about medieval combat. And the tactical principles proven on that bloody plain near Ascalon still influence modern military doctrine in ways that generals study today at war colleges around the world.